Now, it can be tempting to bury your head in the sand or bite your tongue regarding what you know to be true when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement. Maybe you hope that it will soon be over, all fade away like some bad fashion fad from the 80s. But you know as well as I do that even those come back to bite you in the butt years later. I think it's time that the silent majority starts to speak up about the BLM movement before it's too late. Drea Humphrey here with Rebel News, and we have already given you reports on the other side of the story regarding the wolf that cloaks itself with the Black Lives Matter movement. Such reports are ones that mainstream media wouldn't dare to share with you, even if it means that you and your loved ones remain in the dark about a violent revolution that is threatening your freedom, opportunities, and the well-being of your country's future. If you ask me, this is not a matter of black versus white, but instead a matter of good versus evil. Today's interview extends upon my last BLM report that examined the tie between self-proclaimed Marxist Black Lives Matter co-founder Alicia Garza and a Chinese Communist Party front group called the Chinese Progressive Association. In that report, which you can catch up on at rebelnews.com, I outlined why such a pairing is cause for concern, as well as gave an example of how history seems to be repeating itself. However, today's report outlines why the BLM's connection to the CCP is dangerously well on its way to a path of destruction. You see, it's not just about the CCP appearing to be backing the BLM movement. They also appear to be backing the BLM riots, and thus the terror that spawned from them. But why? You have to ask yourself that question. It would be naive not to. And to help you find some of the answers to why there is a matrimony between the Chinese Communist Party and the Black Lives Matter movement, I sat down to interview the author, filmmaker, and public speaker Trevor Loudon. Loudon has been researching the radical left and exposing Marxist and terrorist movements for over 30 years, including uncovering Barack Obama's relationship with Frank Marshall Davis, the Hawaiian Communist member whom we now know Obama looked to as a mentor, someone he repeatedly sought the counsel of, according to Forbes. Loudon recently did an interview with Crossroads from the Epoch Times that outlined the direct ties between the BLM riots and the Chinese Communist Party. I knew that our rebel supporters would also like to hear about this connection, as well as more of what Trevor had to say. So keep watching for that interview. I pointed out the connection between the CPA, the Chinese Progressive Association, and Alicia Garza's foundation. Now, there's been some talk about, oh, wait, that isn't the connection that people are trying to draw. So could you maybe speak into that a little bit for clarification?
Look, there are two Chinese progressive associations. There's actually three. There's one in San Francisco, the main one, a very large one in Boston, and a small one in New York. But for all intents and purposes, they're all run by the same organization. They're independent organizations, but they're all run by the same communist group, which is a group called Liberation Road. It used to be called Freedom Road Socialist Organization. Now it's called Liberation Road, and they have a subgroup called Left Roots. The leaders of the Boston CPA and the San Francisco CPA are both members of Left Roots. They're both affiliated with Liberation Road, and they've both been part of the same Maoist movement since the 1970s. They used to be, both those groups were once run by a group called the League of Revolutionary Struggle. Now that folded into Freedom Road, which then became Liberation Road. So it's the same Maoist communists that have been running all three organizations since the 1970s.
So you have been able to actually draw a connection between some of the riots with the Chinese Communist Party. So
Yeah.
That's fascinating and
It gets,
terrifying.
yeah. Well, it gets a little confusing because the original Maoists in America all coalesced in the late 1980s into a group called Freedom Road Socialist Organization. Now, in the late 90s, that split into two groups, both called Freedom Road Socialist Organization. Now, one of them then became Liberation Road and Left Roots, and that runs Black Lives Matter. But the other Freedom Road Socialist Organization, they're the people who burnt down Minneapolis. They started the George Floyd riots, and they burnt down Kenosha. They rioted. See, each one of these two groups have strengths in different part of the country, and they both support Maoist revolution, both responsive to communist China, and they sort of did a bit of a division of labor. I'll burn this city, you burn that city. I'll burn over here in Northern California, you burn Southern California. I'll burn Tallahassee, you burn Miami. So virtually all of the riots were done by these two groups, and they were always intended to be violent. I have Jess Sundin on tape, a leader of Freedom Road Socialist Organization, the woman who sparked the rioting in Minneapolis by her own admission, talking about the joy she felt when she saw Precinct 3 being burnt to the ground. That the rioting, the looting was an integral part of the movement. This is in her own words on a podcast that is now been deleted, but I have it copied. So they are complete. It was always intended to be violent. It was always intended to be an insurrection, and it was always intended to be timed for election year.
And it was orchestrated to hit Black communities, Black businesses.
Well, see, the trial run was Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. That was done by the Liberation Road faction. And the Chinese, look, a couple of people who'd just been to China went into that area and had talks with the leaders of the burning. They had 10,000 people in there from out of state to burn that city. And you're absolutely right. They targeted the Black businesses because you can't have prosperous Black people because that would destroy the narrative of Black oppression. So, prosperous Black people are Uncle Toms, they're sellouts, in the logic of these people, right?
Yeah.
So this is completely orchestrated by pro-Chinese communist parties.
And one of the things you said, I'm going to read it. You said that anyone who takes a knee to Black Lives Matter is bowing to Chinese communism and terrorism. So our prime minister here in Canada, he took a knee. He bowed. So explain that. That's a very bold statement. Explain that a little bit more for us.
Well, look, the terrorist connection comes through the leaders of the Liberation Road faction. Well, both of the factions, Freedom Road and Liberation Road, have extensive ties to Palestinian terrorists. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Palestine Liberation Organization, etc. Black Lives Matter has sent 3 delegations to the Palestinian territories in the last 3 years for extensive meetings with high-level revolutionaries over there. They openly chant, Ferguson to Palestine, end the occupation. Palestine to Ferguson, we fight to free our nation. They have intimately tied the communist-inspired rebellion in Palestine to the Black Lives Matter movement. And yet all Christians and politicians, even conservatives, taken a knee to Black Lives Matter because everybody wants to be anti-racist. Everybody wants to virtue signal and show how great they are. And they overlook the fact that these are communist terrorist organizations that they are bowing to that have nothing to do with helping race relations or greater justice. They're all about using racial divisions to start a revolution and bring America to its knees. That's what it's all about.
Well, it's interesting you say that because one of the other sort of communities or that they're latching onto is the trans movement too. So it's like, how many groups can we connect and divide people?
Yeah, it's intersectionality, isn't it? You've got to find every area of oppression you can
Yeah.
and widen those divisions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, look, the old class struggle doesn't work very well in America or Canada, because you start out pretty poor and end up pretty rich. You
Right.
start out pretty rich and end up pretty poor too. But race is always with you. Your gender is always with you. Usually your sexual orientation is always with you too. So if you want to, this is the modern way of revolution. The
Mm-hmm.
class struggle has been de-emphasized. The racial, the gender, the transgender struggle is really what these people are working on. And
Mm-hmm.
the Maoists have always emphasized race, the gay liberation movement, etc. That's their way of bringing America to its knees. Because they came out of the Chinese movement, and the Chinese didn't have an industrial working class. Mao didn't have an industrial working class like they did in Russia to use. He had to use the peasants, the ethnic groups, the racial groups to
Mm-hmm.
start his revolution.
So what do you think is the end game here then? If Black Lives Matter, that whole movement becomes successful, what's the end game?
Well, the end game is revolution. You know, with all of these movements, the gay movement, the transgender movement, the women's movement, the issue, the saying from the 70s, the issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution. You know, America is the number one country stopping China from doing what it wants in the world. You know, America is the
Yeah.
only country that can hold China in check. So if America can be taken down, if Trump can be defeated, Biden will gut the US military and he will accommodate China. China is salivating at the prospect of a Biden presidency, because the Chinese know that if Trump gets 4 more years, they will probably have a revolution in their own country. You know,
Yeah.
they're just hanging on by their fingernails there. You know, the Chinese Communist Party is 800 families, and
Mm-hmm.
they're just hanging on to power. Trump's already caned them on trade. He embarrassed them over Hong Kong.
Yeah.
He backed the anti-China candidate in the Taiwanese presidential election, who won. The Chinese Communist Party lost face. And if you lose face in China, you lose power not long after. They are activating their people on the ground, both in elections. They're involved in many elections in America, but also on the streets to basically make the country ungovernable. That was Freedom Road's promise, Freedom Road Socialist Organization. The day Trump was inaugurated, that was their vow, their public vow, to destroy the president by making the country ungovernable. So
Mm-hmm.
China is activating their assets in America to bring down the president, to usher in a new government that will give them everything it wants. It's that simple.
What can the people who have become informed and concerned about this, how can we make a difference?
Look, you can circulate interviews like you're doing right now to as many people as possible. Most people, most patriots, most decent people know that Black Lives Matter is off.
Yeah.
But it's got a very compelling message. Who would be opposed to the Black Lives Matter?
Mm-hmm.
But if they can see that it's a scam, that it's actually using black people as cannon fodder for the revolution that will actually bring communist Chinese to power, that will reduce the power, the psychological, the sort of moral power of the Black Lives Matter movement. And as it's come out that these people are Marxists, you're finding a lot less people are willing to publicly associate themselves with the movement. When people generally understand this is directed by Communist China and the interests of Communist China, I think public support will completely collapse. And you start shaming businesses and churches who are supporting these revolutionaries, and you start boycotting these businesses and churches who are supporting these revolutionaries. That is the power of the informed public to just alter the whole direction these things are going to go.
Thank you so much for taking time out of, I'm sure you're busy, scheduled to be on Rebel News, Trevor.
Look, it's been an honor, and thank you very much. And let's all work for a free North America, shall we?
Absolutely.
From Mexico to Alaska.
Absolutely. Take care.
You're welcome. Thanks very much.
I hope interviews like this encourage you to do your research as well as to use your voice about things that you believe are putting your country and family at risk. At Rebel News, we fearlessly bring you the other side of the story, even if that means calling out the Chinese Communist Party and its prized Black Lives Matter movement. If you'd like to support us in being able to continue on doing so, please share this video with many and then head to helprebelnews.com to donate whatever you can to help keep the other side of the story alive. We appreciate your support.